What does social psychology have to do with history, you might ask? Well, that's what I'm here to tell you. My name is Dr. Sandra Obradovic. I'm a lecturer in psychology at the Open University, and in the next 10 minutes or so, I hope to convince you about the importance of researching the meaning that we give to history and how this constructive process of both remembering and forgetting is used to support or challenge political change in the present. But before we get into my research, let's talk a little bit about how we use history in our everyday conversations. So we refer to the past quite a lot. We sometimes romanticize it and express nostalgia towards it, but we also don't necessarily look back at the past critically. Now, we know that there's a lot of sayings about history, such as history is always written by the victors. The past changes a little bit every time we tell it and retell it. And also, a history is a set of lies that we've all agreed upon. Now, these kinds of sayings communicate something about how history should be understood. Namely, they challenge this idea that history is objective, static, and stable. And instead, they make us aware that history is something that is continuously being constructed and it's being shaped by the needs of the present. And this is exactly what I look at in my research. One of the ways in which my research has explored the links between history, psychology, and politics is through research in Serbia. Serbia is a country that is currently working towards membership in the European Union. And despite having committed to this political change and working towards it for many years, there's still a lot of public ambivalence and public worry around what this political change will mean on a social and cultural level. So, when talking to people in sort of focus group discussions, we quickly find that history is used to question and to challenge the extent to which membership in the European Union is something that is going to be positive for Serbia. Now, because of these intimate links between remembering history and belonging to a group that is informed by this history, we find that any political change that is seen as undermining history, that is seen as rewriting history from the outside, becomes political change that is seen as negative for the group and ultimately political change that is resisted. In simpler terms, the question around whether political change is good or bad for us becomes a question of how much does this change allow us to be who we are in the future. And this idea of being who we are is very much couched in history and in references to how certain cultural and social practices have been part of the group's identity for centuries and for multiple generations. In more recent work in the context of the UK, I've explored this idea of nostalgia. So, nostalgia is probably something that you've come across as a concept before. It's this idea that we romanticize the past. We look back at the past as a time that was simpler, better, or easier, and we long for a time that is similar to that past. Now, a lot of research on nostalgia tells us that it's associated in important ways with particular attitudes. People who are higher on nostalgia tend to be more negative towards outgroups, tend to express anti immigration sentiments, and tend to be supportive of right wing parties. But what it doesn't tell us is what is it that people long for? What is the meaning or the content of these nostalgic thoughts and sentiments? And what can that maybe tell us about people's sense of, or people's grievances in the present? In other words, if there's something that we're longing for in the past, is it because we worry that we don't have it in the present? In order to explore this question, with a colleague of mine, we surveyed over 3,000 participants, asking them about what was the greatest era in British history and why was it the greatest. Now, obviously, this kind of question is asking people to look back at history in a somewhat romanticizing way. But as you'll see in a little bit, there was also resistance that emerged to this question. So, what we identified is four categories of historical representations. The first category related to in-group achievements. So a lot of participants responded to these questions, mentioning the Industrial Revolution, mentioning times and eras that related to general progress, whether it was economic progress, social progress, or technological progress and modernization, making links between the innovations made in the past and the ability to live in a modern society in the present. The second category that we identified was references to times of power and status. Oftentimes, these were references to World War II and participants talking about winning wars, being dominant and influential, not only within the nation, but across the globe. Now, what we see with these references is a sense that this is lost in the present. So in this quote, for example, we see a participant mentioning that one of the greatest eras of British history was a time when Britain was in charge and wasn't ruled by other countries compared to how it is now. A third category of historical representations we've labeled as communality. These refer to participants who looked back at the past as a time of social connectedness and cohesion, a time where people were friendly, respectful, and helped their neighbors. So the sense of having lost a community was also a very prevalent trend in the data. Last but not least, as you can maybe imagine, there was also quite a bit of resistance to the way that we had posed the question. So asking people what was great about British history led some people to question the extent to which we can actually ask these questions and the extent to which we should be looking back at the past in a romanticized way. So this category we've labeled critical nationalism. It's participants who responded by challenging the notion that any part of history is great overall, and emphasizing that every era, every time period has both good and bad sides to it, and it's important to reflect on these and to be critical about how we understand and look back at history. Now, a second question that we then wanted to ask was, do these ways of representing history, these different categories, do they map on differently to people who feel high or low levels of nostalgia, people identify more or less with being British? And we find that they do. So for example, for people who expressed high levels of nostalgia, they were more likely to represent history in a way that emphasized power or status and communality. So people who romanticized and longed for the past were more likely to long for either a time when the group was powerful and dominant, or a time for when the group was more cohesive and there was a sense of community. In contrast, people who had low levels of nostalgia, so people who really didn't look back at the past as something that was better than the present, for these participants, they were more likely to reflect critically on the past, so to argue that we need to think about both the good and the bad about the past, but they were also more likely to look at the past as a time of progress and actually as something that links very nicely with the present and not as something that we should strive to go back to because it's actually led to where we are today. What about questions around identity? How does this then link to how we identify? Well, we also find differences in these categories in relation to how strongly someone identified as British. So among those people who tended to identify more strongly as British, so the degree of identification with British was quite strong, among these people, they were more likely to represent history as a time of power and status, and as a time when the in-group was dominant. In contrast, for those who identified very little with being British, there was more an expression of history from a critical lens and an emphasis on critically engaging with how we represent and narrate history. So let's return back to the question that I posed at the start of this talk. What does social psychology really have to do with history? Well, in my opinion, it has quite a lot to do with history. As I hope to have shown from the two examples of my own research, there are important links between how we give meaning to history and how we define the group, who belongs, and what political actions are seen as justified in the present. In other words, Being able to define history and define the meaning that we give to a nation has important and powerful implications for politics in the present. It is the role of social psychology and the social psychology of history to unearth these links and to show the powerful ways in which history becomes both mobilized and manipulated.